Hi, it's Alan Padgett again. We're going to be looking now at the doctrine of human being called theological anthropology. Some years ago called the doctrine of man, but that's an old translation. That's a bit on the sexist side, talking about what does it mean from a theological perspective to be human. And it turns out there's a bit of a paradox here. On the one hand, human beings are created good, and are good in many ways. In fact, they're created in the image of God. At the same time, human beings are sinners. So we will look first at the doctrine of the human beings who are created in the image of God, and then we will look at the doctrine of sin. Or you could do it the other way, however you want to watch the videos. So we're going to look at human nature, where we understand nature here to be what human beings have in common altogether. So it doesn't have to be some essentialist understanding. It's just whatever it is that makes something a human being, that is our nature. And we share that nature with Jesus. It is also an important theological topic, but we won't be talking about Christ today, but rather about human beings in general. The doctrine of the image of God is often used in theology to talk about, you might say, the spiritual center or the spiritual side of human nature. Well, let's look at some basic facts from Scripture and theology about being human. Humans are created by God along with the rest of creation. So I've heard people very interested in earth-friendly theology, eco-theology, talk about the community of the sixth day. Humans don't get their own day, but we are created along with all the other land mammals. Human beings are made out of dust, but they are also breathed alive by the Spirit of God or the breath of God, and they become living souls. In fact, all animals in the Hebrew Bible have souls. Humans are not meant to be alone. They need each other to live and to flourish. Seems to be a clear teaching from Scripture. You know, it is the first not good thing in the story of creation is the man is alone. And we're going to look quite a bit then at this idea that human beings are created in the image of God. Now, maybe you've heard this idea before. Maybe you've been taught that this soul is the image of God. And many theologians in the ancient times thought the reason was the image of God. Augustine, for example, argues that reason is the highest faculty in the human being, the most like God. Of course, he's influenced by Plato and his understanding of reason as the highest faculty. And therefore, reason is really this place in which we image God. Perhaps it is the fact that we have free will, or that we are spirit and we have a spirituality, whatever and however we understand that. Some have argued not only that it's free will, but it's also morality. So it's free moral agency that makes us in God's image. What it's definitely not is that we look like God. I mean, I know, for example, in this famous painting by Michelangelo on the Sistine Chapel ceiling, he's painted the concept of the image of God into a visual image, because God and Adam are in their bodies the image of each other. Adam is totally naked. God's a bit covered up and has gray hair and a beard, but they look a lot alike. And behind God's other hand is Eve, and Adam's about to find he gets a very happy present from the God, the Creator. So I think that I would like to argue that we are going to move toward a more contemporary understanding of image of God. Not as some, shall we say, aspect of our nature or attribute of human nature, but rather in a way that's functional and relational and has to do with being called. One of the big problems, in my view, with all of those attributes is not everyone who's fully human, who ethically we're going to treat as a full person and as a full human being, is capable of having all of those functions to the greatest extent possible. And so take reason, for example. Is someone who's a lot more reasonable more like God than someone who isn't? So if you think of image of God, though, as a calling that God has given, that we might fulfill certain functions within the community of creation, certain roles, if you will, then it can be something that we're all called to do, whatever our abilities or lack of ability, whatever our gift or practice might be. Every human being can be called to fulfill these functions or to participate with others in fulfilling them. So it looks like, if you read the narrative here of Genesis 1-9 especially, which is the key place where image of God appears. It also appears in 1 Corinthians 11. It appears in one of the teachings of Jesus, but it's not a very common concept in the Scriptures. Where it has become a common concept is in Christian theology, reflecting on and picking up the phrase from Scripture. So I propose that there are these three relational functions or roles that God lays upon the new earth creature, Ha-Adam, the human. One is this idea of being fruitful and multiplying, coming together as unity. We said humans are created to be in community, to be related to each other. There's a certain role or function that we're given with respect to animals and plants to guard and keep them, or, to take care of and guard them, however you want to translate that, Genesis 2:15. It's often thought of maybe a stewardship or care and keeping of the earth. And finally, humans have a special relationship with God. It's true that in the Hebrew Bible, all animals have souls, but humans seem to have a special, particular, personal, spoken relationship with God. Only humans have morality, meaning only humans are given moral laws that they can follow or not follow. So here's a little image of it. If you think of it as like a triangle of these differing callings, these different functions, these different roles. Any word like that makes sense to you, that's sort of what I'm talking about. And this is a standard view, I think, among many theologians today. It goes back most clearly to Karl Barth, but it was also developed by Brunner, his colleague in Switzerland, who taught at a different university than he did, but still in Switzerland. And other theologians have also developed that more recent times. I like to think of this as a holistic understanding of what it means to see human beings as creatures in the image of God. For one thing, the substance or property or attribute view is at least partly right. We need all those attributes to fulfill these roles. We need free moral agency. We need reason, right? We need to be creatures of spirit who can communicate with God and with each other. And the functional view, then, I think, is partly right, too, that we have these specific functions rather than attributes that are what it means to be in the image of God. And maybe picking up on, some phrases Bonhoeffer says once in his little book, Creation and Fall, we could see him being in God's image as a calling that God gives us. So that to be image of God is to be fulfilling the function and calling God gives us sort of at the level of creation. These are not callings we have as church people or even as followers of Christ, although that will strengthen and give that a new context. All human beings have this calling from the Creator. I like this understanding of God's glory and God's image in human beings from the early Christian theologian Irenaeus, who wrote in Greek, but we don't have all of his original Greek manuscript. We do have some, we can fill in the gaps with a Latin translation. So this phrase comes from a Latin part of his works, even though he wrote in Greek. Gloria Dei vivens homo, which you could translate as the glory of God is a human being fully alive. So I think maybe image of God is saying, to be fully alive in all that we are, gives God's glory, and also shows that, in some remote ways we can participate in what God is up to, and the kind of person God is. Very, very distant analogies, of course. So here's some conclusions about this doctrine of image of God. I think the concept of vocation is very important here. So that all humans are in the image of God. It's laid upon the whole species. It's not like some people are more human than others. Some people are more image of God than others. We want to try to avoid that thinking completely. The image of God is not then some thing in us or some attribute, but it's a relationship and a function. So we still need those properties, of course, to fulfill the function. I'm not denying that. Now, the proof that I think this is a relational understanding, the best proof is really from Genesis 3, the fall, part of the doctrine of sin. Because when human beings disobey God, when they use their freedom not to freely love and fulfill God's calling, but to reject God's purpose and to question God and to go their own way, then their relationship with God is broken. They're cast out of Eden, out of paradise, out of talking face to face with God. Their relationship with each other is distorted. So now the woman will desire the man and he will lord it over them. That's Genesis 3, I believe it's 15, but don't quote me on that. I could be wrong. Anyway, and then the earth, when Adam goes out to work the earth, it brings forth thorns and thistles now. So, the relationship between, creation, God, and each other is all distorted by sin. So I think that's suggesting that, God's understanding of what it means to be human. In that story, God is creating a creature that has these relationships. And that image of God is perhaps best understood in this way, that we are a relational being as God is, that we're capable of love and care for others as God is, that we're meant to be in community as God is, and especially that we're meant to be in relationship with God in prayer and obedience and worship.